historians. I hope you guys have had an amazing weekend. I know that I did. Nice and relaxing because I did absolutely nothing. But it is Sunday evening and it's Sunday night and we are getting ready for the work week. So by the time I post this video, we'll likely be halfway through the week. But I did want to sit in front of the camera and do our 10th installment into Unhinged News Stories of the Past. I cannot believe that we're already on number 10, but at last, here we are. So I did want to go ahead and get started because I'm only going to be reading one story today. I'm going to be reading one story today, and it is an article that appeared on a magazine. So this is an article that I'm going to be reading titled The Truth About Female Impersonators that appeared on Jet magazine on their issue dated October 3rd of 1952. So this is going to be a bit of a follow-up to the video that I just did where I was historicizing drag in mainstream popular culture. So in that video, of course, I actually used Jet magazine heavily as a source to talk specifically about the Finney's balls in Chicago and how those were on mainstream magazines like Jet magazine, and how essentially popular drag was even in the 1950s, even though we don't usually associate that era with drag. So just some background on Jet magazine. Jet magazine was founded in 1951 by John H. Johnson. In my last Unhinged News Stories, where I looked at Ebony magazine, they have the same origin story. Jet magazine was founded in 1951 as a weekly Negro news source by John Johnson. And the reason that he actually named it Jet magazine was because he associated Jet with both black and speed. So Jet magazine has that association as black speed. And Redd Foxx, the actor, actually referred to Jet as like the Negro Bible. I'm somebody who, again, is very, very into pop culture. I study pop culture very, very heavily. And usually whenever I look at black culture, like black popular culture in the past, Jet magazine is an amazing source whenever it comes to black magazines of the past. Jet magazine is most definitely my most resourced black magazine that I look at historically, even over Ebony. But they both have the same founder, John H. Johnson. So again, that's just some background on Jet magazine. I'm gonna go ahead though and start this video because even though we are only reading one article, it is a fairly lengthy one that I thought tied very beautifully into the last video that I did. So this one that as I mentioned earlier, is titled The Truth About Female Impersonators. And this specific article appeared on the Jet magazine issue October 3rd of 1952. This is a 73 almost year-old article about drag queens, and it is a very interesting one and very important one for a lot of reasons. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So for the purposes of time, let's go ahead and get started because again, this is a pretty lengthy article, but I am also going to be stopping to give my opinion on some parts of the article as I am reading. So let's go ahead. Nearly every big US Negro community has or has had at least one nightclub where a swishing, clean-shaven men dress in women's clothes and entertain cash customers. In these clubs, the shapely chorus girl is out of place as a hand crank on a Cadillac because the female impersonators have taken over. So in my last video, I do mention that it does seem like black media had certainly a more accepting approach to a lot of drag pageants in the 1950s, 1940s, even in a lot of older instances, because I do talk about the Hamilton Lodge, and a lot of the articles I read of the Hamilton Lodge were actually black newspapers and magazines. So it is very interesting here to see the writer note that every major black city does, of course, like have their own sort of like drag or drag queen club in the 1950s. So I did want to point that out there as well. Before a gawking public, they appear in garish women's wear, gaudily made up in everything from rouge to toenail polish. Actually, in many mannerisms, female impersonators are often more feminine than real women, but many others are grotesque caricatures of real women. In most nightclub floor shows, the most feminine of impersonators leads the show, which includes at least one chunky woman in a sausage-tight dress who wails blues songs about the troubles she is having with a no-good man. The impersonator's contempt for the audience is often shown in the numerous quips that fly back and forth between the audience and the stage. At a Chicago club, the principal entertainer, answering catcalls from the audience, said, "Dearies, don't you take on like that with me. Where was you last night? It was no woman you was with." Then with hands on hips added, "I know there's plenty of you out there who wish you had the nerve to act like me." That is so funny to me because they're just going to the audience and being like, a lot of y'all want to dress like this, but you can't. Ordinarily, the clubs that use female impersonators exclusively are not a town's best night spots. For years, the 101 Ranch in New York headlined female impersonators. In Detroit, it was Uncle Tom's Cabin. In Chicago, female impersonators always have big audiences at Joe's Deluxe Club. Perhaps the most famed of all such show places is Pinocchio's in San Francisco, where good-looking white men cavort like women and wear fine clothes. So far, the clubs, big or little, have not raised special police problems, except in those cities where such masquerades are forbidden by law. But the increased number of impersonators outside of clubs do raise other important problems, and some almost unanswerable questions. One question: is society now more tolerant of the deviant male, and does this encourage men to wear women's clothes? The answer to this is a qualified yes. But society still scorns feminine men and often puts them in jail for perversion. Another question: why would a man risk society's disapproval by masquerading as a woman? The answer to this lies in the obscure causes of homosexuality, and the causes of it are not clearly evident. Some men apparently are born with twisted sex lives. Others acquire sex perversion early in life as a result of family conflicts or problems. The third question is hardest of all to answer. Why do audiences get such a big kick out of female impersonators? Some psychiatrists say that impersonators reflect latent homosexual qualities in the audience. Women might like to watch men act the way they do because the impersonator often overacts. To women, this may be like a big joke on their own sex. So I want to comment on this one as well, because they are tying female impersonating and drag queens to homosexuality. And the way that he describes it as a sort of a perversion that could afflict somebody during their childhood, or it's something that they're born with. Oftentimes when I do mention like drag pageants or the popularity of drag, don't confuse that necessarily with this general tolerance of queer or gay people. It is very, very important to note here that even though they are sort of tolerating these drag pageants, at the end of the day, it is a spectacle. It's something that they're coming to watch because they find it very fascinating. It does not in any way, shape, or form mean that they were very tolerant of gay people or like the homosexual. So you can kind of clearly see that with this article. Men who wear women's clothes are correctly called transvestites, but rarely do they use this big word themselves. They call their costumes drags and themselves gay. This is something I also wanted to harken as well. There's a video I saw from like 1996, which is like 40 plus years after this article, where a reporter does refer to RuPaul as a transvestite. And a lot of people in the comments were like, just kind of like, okay, why would you call RuPaul a transvestite? He's just a drag queen. He's actually like a cisgendered man. I did want to note here that he mentions that even though they are referred to as transvestites, most of them, even in 1952, were referring to themselves as gay and what they were doing as drags. So again, there are photos here of like drag queens specifically, but I do really want to point out that they were, even in the 1950s, referring to themselves as gay. So let's go ahead and finish the rest of this. So men have worn drag for as long as history recalls. Anthropologists have found Indian squawks who really could have been braves, and in Africa, many tribes permit marriage between men. Not all men who dress as women for profit are queer. Two would-be slick Harlem grifters posed as women and lured men to hotels and hallways where they robbed them. That is an Unhinged News story that I need to find one day. I'm sure there were plenty of examples. Yale and Harvard students regularly give plays in which men portray both male and female roles. No one questions the directions of their libidos. Often their clumsy switchings and mincing gait are hilarious. The French, in one of their best movies, Grand Illusion, used an entire sequence in which World War I prisoners dressed as women and did the can-can. There was nothing homosexual about it. With most female impersonators, however, it is a much more serious business because many transvestites feel more comfortable in women's clothes. Some go all the way, others wear only some feminine articles. For those transvestites who go all out, Halloween is their night. All year in Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, and New York, men who work as truck drivers, piano tuners, and clerks save their money for one big splurge in women's clothes. It is the only time of the year that I can assume the role for which I am best fitted. I dress as a woman, one transvestite said. No matter how much they pay for their clothes or how they swank their look, most transvestites have one problem in common. Big feet, man-sized shoes, feet rarely fit women's shoes, and many transvestites have to cram their hefty feet into tiny shoes. At a recent Los Angeles annual drag, over 600 persons paid $2.40 each to see male transvestites cavort, court, and cash in on their clothes. The crowd stampeded when Betty Boop's brother of famed boogie-woogie pianist Meade Lux Lewis did a grind. The crowd disappeared through the slide doors, however, when the police came. So they were still kind of fully raiding some drag pageants and things at this time, and I thought that was like a pretty interesting tidbit that I kind of wanted to hone in on here, that police are still showing up and they are raiding this. And even in Chicago, with the exception of like certain events like the Finney's Balls, and you could say the same thing for New York, it wasn't always accepted. It was kind of just like, okay, this is their time this year to go ahead and dress as women. And the writer is alluding to that in this article as well. At that affair, and others like it, transvestites not only adopt women's clothes, but appropriate names of famed women as well. On the guest roster were spurious Lena Hornes, Josephine Bakers, a Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and a Mary Bethune. I looked up the Chiang Kai-shek, and they're more of like a historical figure, but I guess they took on like a drag persona of him. And then of course you have Lena Horne, Josephine Baker, and Mary Bethune. Those are obviously very famous, highly regarded women. And I did mention in my last video about drag personas and how a lot of drag queens do most certainly take on the characters of very famous and glamorous women, with Lena Horne and Josephine Baker being very wonderful examples of that. In the old days, I might have found out I said, in the old days, even in the 1950s, this was old. In the old days, most famed transvestites chorus was at the Cabin Inn, a Chicago resort which could seat 1,000 persons and headlined a 6-member all-male chorus. One of the most overt transvestites called himself Gloria Swanson and rode in a Pierce Arrow auto. Although the biggest shows are now closed, more and more female impersonators are headlined at nightclubs. To chorus girls, this is a new and real threat. An unemployed Corrine in Washington, D.C. said police ought to stop them. But in most cities, police do not stop the shows, and audiences encourage them by coming early and staying late. For apparently their entertainment fare continues to hold a curious grip in a thrill-seeking public. Again, that was a lot. I get it, but I did want to share that article with you guys for several reasons. So let's break some of that down. That was a pretty lengthy article, but I do think that more so than the video that I just did, it really breaks down a lot of the views that people would have had with drag queens in the 1950s. And I do kind of want to make the separation here. They do mention like transvestites or like essentially trans people. There is the difference there where there are drag queens, let's say like RuPaul, who do perform in drag and they have a drag persona, but in their normal everyday lives they are like these cisgendered men, versus people who are doing drags but may also, you know, take hormones and things like that, and identify more as, you know, female in their day-to-day lives. So there is the heavy use of transvestite in that article, and again, this is the 1950s, this is from 1952, but again, I did want to point out that one, you do see the popularity of a lot of drag pageants and balls, and he mentioned cities like Chicago, San Francisco, New York, Detroit, where you have sort of like these really thriving drag scenes, but they are usually held at certain times of the year, which is when police acknowledge them. And at the exact same time, they are things that fascinate people. And not everything is tied to, let's say, this admiration for this sort of art form, as it is oftentimes like this really like curiosity, this fascination with this man who is dressing as a woman for performances. And it is also worth noting, of course, as the writer mentions there, the idea of like the sex pervert, let's say, like the homosexual, and views on gay people at that time, which are still very much in line with mainstream societies and media's idea of, you know, really what a gay person would be. But at the exact same time, it is very ironic when you consider that that is their view of gay people. They're also fully associating many drag queens with being gay, as he mentions that they call themselves gay, while at the exact same time there seems to be this tolerance tied to drag queens and drag performers because of how fascinating these events are. And of course they are a huge way to make money. So I could see why a lot of cities, major cities where you have these very big and thriving drag scenes, do not exactly send police after a lot of them, because these are ways that the city can make money. There's a financial profit there. But I just thought that was an article that I really wanted to share with you guys, not only because it ties so heavily with what with my last video, but because it really takes you into the perspective of what a lot of people would have felt about drag queens in that era. He also does mention the views that a lot of chorus girls may have had on drag queens, which I think are a little misplaced, because I don't think, he mentions here like these really big burly men trying to fit into these tiny female shoes. They were never going to steal the job of like a chorus girl. We all know that's a little bit ridiculous. I think we can see a chorus line of drag queens or a chorus line of, women, and we can tell that there's a very big difference there. But again, some of those fears, some of those concerns are all outlined in that article. So yeah, that was just an article, The Truth About Female Impersonators, from Jet Magazine in October of 1952. Would you look at that? That was it. That is the entire 10th edition of Unhinged News Stories of the Past. And again, this was this was from the magazine, like the last one. Next week, I'll be back to newspapers. I did find a pretty good one, so, look out for that. But I did just, again, want to sit down and do this installment for Unhinged News Stories of the Past. I hope you guys really enjoyed that one. And of course, as with the others, I'm going to be linking that below. Thanks again for watching this video. Thanks as always for your support. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. But again, thanks so much for watching. Bye.